Well, thank you for having me back after 10 years. What I'm going to talk about is, in a sense, a script to order. The orders were given by David Spielhalter, who basically said it's now just over 10 years since I gave that presidential address, had suggested it perhaps might be interesting just to have a look and comment on what's happened in the interim in relation to what I focused on at the time with the usual phraseology of evidence-based whatever. And he also suggested that that might be a bit sort of dry, very rude of him. So he also suggested that perhaps it might liven it up if I talked about something that I've been personally involved in recently. So that's really what I intend to do. A rather disgraceful title, I must admit, of that presidential address. But what I did in 1996, basically starting off with recalling the motivation of, if you like, the founding fathers of the Royal Statistical Society and the discipline of statistics. And if you go back to those early days in the 1830s, it was quite clear that what they were about, using a very different language, what they were about and what they believed is that the appropriate collection of quantitative evidence would lead to better politics, better decisions in society, and what we might now refer to as an evidence-based society, by which I guess we mean one in which informed, logical, quantitative reasoning has a major role to play as an accepted standard for conducting elements of public debate, as well as underlying decision-making processes of government, business, and individuals. However, when I gave the talk in 1996, I think the thrust of what I was trying to say was, I had contributed to this process myself, huge amounts over decades of efforts at refining the tools of statistical thinking and analysis. Huge numbers of trees sacrificed to statistical methodology and theorems. And actually at the same time, a very major growth in the volume of statistical education. So wherever you look, there's statistical journals, there's statistical thinking, there's mathematical results, there's people being educated. And yet, for me at least, in 1996, I'll come to the present shortly, it was immensely depressing, in a sense, to witness the innumerate and confused nature of so much of the political, public, and media reaction to major issues which prima facie were tailor-made for proper discussion of uncertainty and risk. And in 1996, two very topical issues at the time were mad cows and ecstasy, hence the title. Incidentally, if you want to boost your citation index for the future, pick titles like this. My God. All the wonderful mathematical papers I've written in my life, this was 2,000 times the citation. What I tried to do was focus on what I perceived as the confused and irrational nature of the public debate of the time on the then topical issues of BSE. It was just after the BSE epidemic. And the Daily Mail and others were going crazy on the effects of ecstasy. And I thought that was really so profoundly depressing if you think of all the talented people who spent all that time developing statistical toolkits and educating people in statistical ideas, and the front page of every newspaper was just utter garbage. So I asked a very naive question, why is this? Where do the problems lie? I mean, is it our fault? Is it simply a technical and public relations failure on our part to communicate sufficiently clearly and aggressively what we know to be the importance of statistics and the relevance of the discipline? Or are there much more deep-seated social and educational obstacles? So that was the sort of theme around which I gave that talk. And I noted also at the time that we've gone way beyond the original ideas and ambitions and aspirations of the founding fathers of the Royal Statistical Society, which now look rather humble, which was the collecting and arranging of numerical facts. And not just, as many of you will know, not just the humble ambition, but actually an ideology that said it would be improper to go beyond that and start interpreting them. We've come a long way since then. And the now much expanded spectrum of activities that comes under the heading of statistics, we're familiar. The things that still go on, the bread and butter stuff, data collection and presentation, inference from relatively small samples, small sample surveys or experiments. And I have to say, looking back after on my own life, I think far too many people have spent far too much time on that part of the spectrum. In recent years, there's been, I think, a welcome move to what you might call the modeling and analysis of large, complex systems, which is where a lot of the action is. And a lot of the stuff at this conference, it's not just the sort of individual samples or surveys or the individual large complex system, but it's actually, if you like, the evidence synthesis across large numbers of things that all relate to the same kind of questions. And I think that's sort of wonderful, and that's, again, now where the action is. But have enough of us been involved, and have we made enough impact on that broader territory of involvement with the kind of people and the kind of thought processes that exist in the worlds of politics and the mechanisms of public policy? I'll come back to that. Now, given that we all probably at one time or another are in this business because we're turned on by mathematics or by models or by the joy of seeing clear messages from pages or files of messy data, we have to keep reminding ourselves, I think, that for most people and politicians and policy analysts, the beauty of statistics doesn't lie in the refinements of those methods or the joy of the theorems or the elegance of the MCMC, but it's through the perceived evidence that's communicated at the end of that process for use in that wider domain. So again, I said in 1996, if we try and engage more with that kind of community, it gives rise to a rather different perspective on the communication of statistical issues. So I asked, in some sense, in 1996, what in concrete terms could we usefully do to try and move that agenda along? And it will now sound slightly quaint, I think, that I devoted so much time to it, but in 1996 I was reviewing, what others on a wider stage had done that had been making an impact and was making an impact. And in particular, and as I say, this it will sound a little bit quaint, I spent a lot of time getting excited about this thing called the evidence-based medicine movement. So you have to remember in 1996 that Cochrane was not a household word, and that lots of people in an audience at the AGM of the Royal Statistical Society were not perhaps up to speed on what was going on in evidence-based medicine and Cochrane. So what I noted then, as somebody who themselves had not really worked in that domain and perhaps over the course of the early 90s had come to realize and be very interested in what was going on there, I sort of asked the question 10 years ago that I noted the evidence-based medicine movement had been enormously successful in raising the scientific level of debate and input in those arenas of application, and asked the simple question, basically, what was so special about medicine? Because at the end of the day, we're confronted daily with controversy and debate across a whole spectrum of public policy issues, where perhaps social rather than medical science should be providing the appropriate evidence base. So what was going on that all this happened in medicine and it wasn't happening elsewhere? And I've heard the same questions asked at a session I've just been at, so maybe nothing's changed. But typically, other than perhaps in medicine, I mean, if you just look at the dominance of sessions and you look at publications, the evidence-based stuff in medicine still hugely dominates. And I thought, well, just go back and say the simple question, what works? That we have the successes of evidence-based medicine, why aren't we working towards evidence-based everything? So, you know, what does work in the classroom, what works in preventing reoffending in penal policy. Now, when it comes to one of my next slides, this will look incredibly naive, but in 1996, that was really the position. So what I suggested then was there was an opportunity for statisticians, together with appropriate allies in other learned societies, media, perhaps to launch some sort of campaign directed at developing analogues of the Cochrane collaboration to provide suitable evidence bases in other areas besides medicine, with the aim of achieving a much-needed shift, I'm quoting now, in the quantitative maturity of public policy debates. Very pompous speech it was. So it was interesting because soon after 1996, I changed life and gave up getting up in the morning, reading statistical journals and scribbling Greek letters on blank sheets of paper, and then ordering hordes of young people to do computations all day, and went off to run a university. And I did that in about 1998. And so I will confess that that was quite a tough job in the first few years. So I probably didn't read much between 1998 and early 2000 and something or other. But soon on in the 2000s, the RSS relaunched what was Series A, I guess, as Statistics in Society. And I think the first issue of that had this wonderful, rousing editorial by Carol Fitzgibbon from Durham on exactly the same theme, almost word for word, that I'd been bashing on about in 1996. So she noted with concern that she was still encountering in the 21st century graduates in the social science who seem to have learnt at university that one cannot do proper experimentation in the social sciences, and I quote, because there are many variables and we don't always understand which ones are important. You can hear Fisher turning in his grave at this point. And in the absence of proper experiments and comparative studies, we continue to have these vacuous debates about what works in social care, what works in education, and we waste significant resources. Education, decades of spending to drive up standards, and I think to this day, no clear basis on which to reach any kind of consensus and unambiguous conclusions about what's happened. And this failure, that particular failure in education, to identify what works, or perhaps it's more to do with posing the right question in the first place. But that's in an organizational context, schools, and an activity teaching, which compared with almost anything else you could think of out there in the wilder forests of society, you've got fantastic opportunity to control and to experiment. She gave another of examples that I don't think I'll quote, of studies which illustrate basically that in many areas with the best of intentions, and I think one of the problems is that many who are involved in social research actually have kind of emotional and political allegiances to doing good things. Which is wonderful, except that it's terrible, because good intentions, guessing, and slick PR is not a basis for effective actions. And actually, the unemotional distance that mathematicians try and cultivate, of course, is very important. We can only check theories and hypotheses with properly designed studies. Fisher, at some stage, I gave a Fisher Memorial lecture, and he had wonderful things to say back in the 50s on the smoking and lung cancer debate about the use of modern publicity and the use of eloquence in place of evidence. what would he have said about the debate the last few weeks and months, years of public debates about genetically modified food, and even now still rumbling on MMR vaccine. So it is still depressing, I have to say, but I'm going to try and get more upbeat as I go along. Just a little bit perhaps on not technical but more hard-nosed. The acquisition of evidence, of course, there are technical problems in social sciences and public policy contexts that we have to recognize. In supposedly replicated social surveys or experiments, outcomes are often measured in subtly different ways. In education, different measurements of achievement, different questionnaire scales, etc. And a long history before sort of meta-analysis came in of combining studies in some sense by what used to be called vote counting. How many studies showed this and how many showed that, and so on and so forth. And also shifting the debate away from is there an effect of this, that, and the other, to what's the magnitude of the effect. I mean, the stuff that we've come to think of as substantive rather than statistical significance has taken a long time. But in recent times, I say the positive thing is really work on effect sizes and meta-analysis as a positive trajectory. However, given what I said in 1996, we now have a whole plethora of things which mimic or correspond to the Cochrane collaboration across great swathes of the social sciences. And there are a few things mentioned there which you all know about. And I'll say in a minute that for somebody whose day job precludes much reading around this stuff, I'm deeply grateful to my colleague Deborah Ashby, because when I agreed to do this, I suddenly realized I'd need to take a 3-month sabbatical now to read the kind of literature that's evolved around this. So I take that as a measure of success in some sense, that now there's an enormous amount going on. What a lot of it is doing, however, is mimicking the original small foothills, it seems to me, of the Cochrane collaboration. And many of these things have not achieved the same kind of maturity by any means. So there's still a lot to do. And I would like to make one critical comment. I think there's an element in the statistical repertoire which is still hugely underplayed in all this stuff. And it's essentially experimentation. Campbell, I'll quote in a second, he called for what he, I don't know if you know this stuff, in one of the things he wrote, he called for the experimenting society, not the evidence-based society, the experimenting society, that would make hard-headed, multi-dimensional evaluations of outcomes, and when the evaluation of one form showed it to have been ineffective or harmful, would move on and try other alternatives. And one of his most important articles, fabulously called Reforms as Experiments. And I think that's still the missing ingredient. There is the American Educational Research Association 2003. There's a current advocacy of so-called design experiments in the social sciences, which I think if you dig deep, looks like a reinvention of statistical sequential design and evolutionary operation methods that, of course, were statisticians took into the process industries about 40 years ago. Now, I still think there's enormous scope for that, but clearly you'll tell me that will run up against political obstacles. And so at some stage, one really needs to get ideological. It seems mad to have 5,500 secondary schools around the country at 11 o'clock every day, everybody doing the same thing. We have a marvelous opportunity for devolved opportunity and experimentation, but it will require, of course, a huge culture shift. So we must become an experimenting society. I think this might have been Professor Fitzgibbon, but I don't know where I got this from, the quote. If it was worth hundreds of Taguchi experiments to identify the optimal form of washing machine, it's surely worth a few thousand to identify real and sustainable improvements in our educational system. Back in '96, we were all worried, of course none of us are now, about the independence and integrity of the government statistical service. And there have been changes and progress. I might comment on a little bit of that later. Looking at what's going on in evidence-based public policy, again, this is thanks to Deborah for giving me some sort of taxonomy on the literature that enabled me to try and do some systematic reading. I mean, methodology, application, research utilization is all the bread and butter sort of statistical stuff. There's a lot of going on this week. I think back to the debate, there's a very interesting key question which, if you take evidence-based stuff seriously, you have to ask up front, and it has been asked, what is the evidence for evidence-based policy? The School for Policy Studies at Bristol is a very interesting thing in 2003. Age-related reading needs. While there's a great deal of literature about the relationship between evidence and policy, and evidence-based policy rhetoric is an essential component of the Modernizing Government initiative, there's less understanding of how evidence is actually used in practice by real policymakers. So they went off and did a load of qualitative research. And I will just quote two things that they say. That policymakers would be willing to concede that policy ought to be evidence-informed, but not evidence-based. And I think that's a subtle thing that I possibly think is right. That you cannot go in one direct line and leap from here is the evidence, so this must be the policy. I mean, there is a whole hinterland of intervening stuff there. But the more important point, and I will quote, however, the dominant model of policymaking is rather one of power bargaining and negotiation. Evidence is explicitly welcomed in this context when it is useful as a weapon in the struggle to control and justify policy direction. Evidence does not necessarily reduce the role of ideology or conviction-based policies, rather it's taken up and used to make arguments based on ideology and conviction, which is the phrase I used last night after Peter Hennessy's talk, which is exactly that, of course, evidence-based policy or policy-based evidence. We have some problems. I won't say much about the particular statistical dimensions of these things. This wonderful conference, is just full of terrific contributions and advances on all this essential stuff that underlies what we're trying to do. And I merely regret that I have the kind of day job that wouldn't allow me to come all week. So I'd like to congratulate Tim, David Spiegelhalter in particular, for what this conference is. Not least actually for inviting me to come up yesterday and today, thereby saving me from 3 speeches and 700 handshakes at Queen Mary graduation. So, on the major issue of risk and risk communication, again, let me just say, it is really very encouraging that as a result of a major donation, the University of Cambridge has created a new chair devoted entirely to this key area. I think that's fantastic. And even more encouraging, of course, that David Spiegelhalter is to be the first holder of that chair. As I said at the beginning, one of the things David suggested was, in addition to making sort of general avuncular remarks about the general situation, it would be interesting perhaps to say something more detailed about something I've recently been involved in. So I'm going to take the rest of the time, but with a little code at the end, to relate my recent experiences in the world of crime statistics. which I'm now a guru and an expert, and I knew absolutely nothing about 18 months ago. You may have, those of you who were at the crime session yesterday morning with David Ryan and John Simmons might have got a whiff of some of this. But basically, I will tell you about a review group I chaired, the conclusions we came to, and hot off the press, in this file of PowerPoint, is the PowerPoint that was used at the Home Office yesterday to basically announce the basis of new policy initiatives in crime stats policy based on that report. Then finally, I'll try and come back and reflect a bit on what practical and political lessons I might have learnt from any of this, and make some tentative suggestions to the President of the Royal Statistical Society on what the Royal Statistical Society might do next. I'm going to come back to this one at the end. In February 2006, I got a phone call from Charles Clarke, who I'd worked with in doing a review on mathematics when he was Secretary of State for Education, and saying, would I chair a group of very disparate individuals to see if there was anything practical we could do about restoring trust in crime statistics. Charles Clarke had found, when he was on the hustings in the, whatever it was, 2001-2002 election, that you couldn't get any sensible debate about crime policy or options in relation to crime because it was all clouded by the fact that, go back to my title, that, you know, lying figures, figuring liars, we don't believe a word of it, there's no basis here. And that this was being used politically among parties, and there was no basis whatsoever to have a sensible national discussion on a major area of policy. So he said, wouldn't it be fun if I gave you a group of people hand-picked to never to be able to agree on this issue and see what happened? And so he lined up criminologists, policemen, police standards authorities, people who had run victim support, people from the Home Office, the odd statistician, and people selected and nominated by different political parties to represent different parts of the political spectrum. So, to parody, you know, bleeding heart liberals to the ex-deputy chief of police in Chicago, who's built like a brick wall and is 8 foot wide, and the remit was to get a consensus on how to restore trust in crime statistics in the UK. Inside page of the Financial Times today, rising fear of crime sparks debate. So this is against the background of very dubious, I have to say, ways of counting and measuring fear, but whatever way you count and measure fear, fear of crime is going up whilst actual crime is going down. Dilemma. So, and I will dwell just a little bit on this slide. What are the issues that have undermined public trust? And try and see from this whether there are wider things one might learn about dialogue, both with public and with political masters, and the negotiation of how one moves policy forward. These are the conclusions. They're not exhaustive, but these are the main conclusions of this disparate group that I chaired. And I have to say, well, I'll come back to the lessons at the end. But this was a group of people who each in their own world was a big cheese, you know, who really knew stuff and had absolutely no deference for any kind of other authority, statistician, president of the Royal Statistical Society, forget it. I was deputy chief of police in Chicago. So that group was not predisposed to identify things in common, but they did. And these are the clear things that emerged on which we had a consensus. That if you are quoting to individual members of the public claimed facts and figures that have absolutely no resonance whatsoever with their own experience, you're in trouble. Now, why do we have that with national statistics? Well, it's exactly the same old issue as skew income distributions. If you have millions of very poor people and a handful of very rich people and you quote average income, you're referring to nobody. crime is immensely skewed. So there are huge tracts of the country where nothing is going on, and a few streets which are mayhem. So those who live in areas where nothing is going on look at the national statistics and say, Christ, it's much worse than I thought it was. And those who live in the back streets of Liverpool say, liars, I know it's a lot worse than that. Problem. Then we have definitions that do not accord with common sense. Hands up all those who knew that bigamy was a violent crime. Now, I didn't really want you to put your hand up. And how many of you know that less than 50% of things categorized as violent crime leads to any form of injury to a person? Once you get this kind of mismatch between conventional common sense use of words and categories, and you're tracking this stuff, you've got a problem. Different sets of statistics with conflicting messages. I mean, we triangulate what's going on in crime in different ways. One way, we survey victims. That's the British Crime Survey. The other way, we get the police to send in all the notifiable offences that they've recorded. They're actually two entirely different worlds of discourse. Whereas the definitions didn't change over a long period with the British Crime Survey, every so often the rules would go out to the police to send in their data in a different way. And in particular, the number of notifiable crimes was increased. Hey, surprise, the number of police notified crimes went up. They went up when the British Crime Survey was going down. So the press say, figuring liars, what's going, and also it has to be said, the British Crime Survey grew up 25 years ago where it was improper to interview perhaps the under-16s. So actually there's no record of victim crime under 16s. There's no record of victim crime of people who live in group residences like student residences, old people's homes. These are clearly gaps. And when people see gaps, again, these figuring liars are trying to suppress the truth. They're not telling us what's going on. Not to speak of the fact that we haven't had systematic measure of business and industrial crime. And also the ever-present suspicion that because the police are judged, their performance is judged on the basis of these figures, they must be cooking them, mustn't they? Because it would be to their advantage. And an unfortunate history of ministerial spin on government statistics. All that. Now, I'm not going to go through in great detail the recommendations. You can read the report. But one that addressing how do you make things relevant to the individual, you've got to shift from the national to local forms of measurement, communication, and dialogue. And it fits perfectly with a wider piece of policy to get into neighborhood policing, community policing. And we were very, very clear that this could make a fantastic difference. And it actually is quite radical in what it does to the notion of statistics. Instead of statistics being a static thing that you pile up and once a year you have a press conference and then everybody distorts it on the front page of the Daily Mail, it's a live entity that you negotiate with your local population. And I'll say a little bit more about that form of negotiation, but you'll see it in the Home Office response in a minute. It's perfect for the modern technology of geographic mapping as a mode of communication. And it hands back, if you like, the statistics to the local population, and it hands back power. Because you can negotiate locally. As you show the pictures of what's happening where, you can listen to your local community as to what they want you to do next week. Now, of course, that will play havoc with the rates, and but it'll be so complicated, the Daily Mail won't understand it. But local people will. Overhauling the scope and definition of national is way overdue. I don't think anybody argues. Still the slightly vexed question of the independence and integrity of government statistics, hugely bound up with the new bill that I think went through Parliament yesterday, and the new Statistics Board, which is going to get the power to look at, audit, and comment upon and report to Parliament on independence. So all that kind of stuff. I'm going to move on quickly. Said all that. I do have a little bit to say on this. We still have major work to do, and I'm sure Tim knows this very well, through the new Statistics Board, looking at lines of command and management of statisticians managing national statistics. Now, there's a real tension here between the relevance of statistical work and its independence. If you completely separate the two, I think this country is absolutely right not to do so. If you're not involved in department policy, if statistics isn't being used within departments for quite legitimate departmental policy development reasons, it becomes irrelevant. It becomes sterile. And it's the nature of the beast that you can't necessarily separate the individuals as those who do that and those who might be involved in the national statistics that are going to form part of public presentation. But what you can do is ensure management arrangements that don't that make clear the division between the two. And I won't go into detail, but in the report, one of our recommendations is that statisticians of certain seniority should actually always be employed by the national statistician and contracted out to departments, and all their career development, all their performance management be handled by the national statistician. The idea of the Statistics Board, and again, the Royal Statistical Society needs to keep pushing this, we have to get the clarity of the production and presentation of national statistics has clear blue water from departmental interference and control. A major issue that was still being messed up yesterday in this year's release of this year's statistical data. The press conference takes place at the Home Office by somebody of tremendous integrity, Paul Wiles. But I want that press release to be in a totally different place, organised by the new Statistics Board, absolutely arm's length from the Home Office. In terms of the integrity of police data, actually most of the stuff we wanted is now in place. There's, like, as in with financial regulation, you have a distinction between the front office, if you like, the guys who are using the data and in real life making money out of it, and the back office which records and controls. And that's, for the most part, now in place in the police. So let me very quickly whip through. These are the slides that were used at the Home Office yesterday. And I'll do it very quickly because the message is very simple. They reviewed the fact that three things have been going on, really. My review, the Statistics Commission did a parallel review, came up with fairly similar conclusions. And in terms of the independence and integrity, the Statistics Bill has proposed this new independent board. But now I think the rest of us have to make sure that that board does the job we want it to do. But in terms of my particular recommendations, essentially, in detail, all the things that my group said we wanted done are basically going to be done. There are a few little quibbles, but not worth actually talking about. Just to say, I can't give a lecture on this because I don't have the material, but I think future RSS conferences, you might get somebody over, let's say, from Chicago, where this is deeply embedded as a way of the local police working. These are not Chicago, this is actually Yorkshire and Humberside. The use of geographic mapping and the fabulous technology available, you can do spots of crimes, you can do distance maps of crimes from various residences, you can do them distances from bus routes, etc., and it becomes a fantastic kind of analytical tool. And all the experience says people really do understand this stuff. People really weren't queuing outside the Home Office. I can't see why. The public weren't queuing outside the Home Office yesterday to get the 60-page set of tables and figures. But this stuff will work. In terms of national statistics, all the things we suggested are going to be done. In particular, one of our things was there should be an independent board that looks at the kind of methodology and the changes to the British Crime Survey, and it was announced yesterday in the Home Office that Sheila Bird will be the first chair of that independent thing. So I think a success. They're looking at changing the classifications of violent crime. double-edged, because if you make a common sense definition, you make any change to definitions, the press will immediately say you're fiddling the figures. So this has to be handled very carefully through a proper communication strategy. And one of the obvious things is to run for 1 or 2 years the old definition and the new definition so that you understand carefully what the changes are. And there's a lot of kind of call, is it possible to develop a sort of weighted crime index which somehow takes more account of the more serious stuff and less account of the less serious stuff? And I think this has to go out for debate with other stakeholders, including journalists. But the major one that is a complete nonsense at the moment is the definition of violent crime. I say everything from bigamy to pushing somebody slightly in the arm in a pub and then walking away. It just doesn't make sense. So in the States, they don't actually do any kind of low-life stuff in the national reporting. It's really only serious crimes, and there's a lot of sense in trying to do that here. As I say, dangers in moving towards it, but we came up with the following: crimes which actually cause physical injury or where the threat to inflict such injury is likely to frighten a reasonable person. And I got that gang of 10 totally disparate people to come up with that one. But maybe you can do better. Just in case you're interested in reality, the red line is British Crime Survey overall figures, which have been in decline for a decade, seem to be slightly flattening off, except for drink-related crimes between the hours of 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. Those of you who read your papers this morning. Massive rise in drunken mayhem. Total offence, drink-related offences between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. in last year, 950,000. This year, 957,000. Changes to police-recorded crime, the blue bit. You might also have read this morning, 9% increase in cannabis, something or other. That's the change in law which does on-the-spot fines and warnings for cannabis, totally accounts for it. So you can unpick all this stuff if you want to. Okay, I'm going to wind up right now with what are the lessons from all this? In terms of the kind of group that I chaired, significant operators in their own fields, used to being authorities, everybody in that group, very sophisticated people, they all assumed that the police and ministers spun things. That was their starting point. They all assumed that. This isn't just the Daily Mail. They were very adversarial about the whole thing, and adversarial to each other, and in particular to me as a statistician. So I was colluding in all this stuff. So one of the things was the agreement on key issues was a long process, and it goes back to that, to Peter Hennessy and the rest, a long process of negotiation and debate, not an immediate acceptance that there are experts called statisticians and they can tell you things. Nothing. So, but a combination of detailed briefing, debate, personal interaction over 6 months, that report was a complete consensus of all those people. And I just wonder if there are sort of lessons of how to build stakeholder buy-in among important opinion formers before you ever get to the point of trying to launch this stuff and change stuff. In terms of the agenda for Oh, I know what I did. I actually got it right, didn't I? So it's in the right place. There. I want to come back now to major issues that still exist. The communication of statistics, the nonsense that people still not understanding significance and so on, and the role of press officers, and just suggest a short possible agenda for the Royal Statistical Society. I sat in on the press conference on the announcement of this year's figures, and I have to say, still the kind of levels of understanding and empathy of any kind among most of the journalists who were there in terms of basic statistical understanding is terrifying. 10 minutes explaining statistical significance and noting that a particular category, given the size of the British Crime Survey and the low rate of occurrence, plus minus 5% meant nothing. I don't know, I think the figure might have been 4%. On Sky TV, an hour later, something rockets up by 4%. So, to the RSS. It's time you renewed the thoughts of having a major campaign on schools of journalism to actually get the same kind of status for basic training in stats as you currently have, for example, on local government finance. And because most of the journalists are already out there needs to be something to do with continuing professional development that offers the same thing. And I just offer the thought that a soft target at the moment, because it's so on the rocks in terms of integrity, might be the BBC. In terms of, as a reference here to the House of Commons Science and Technology Select Committee, they produced a report earlier this year or the end of last year expressing tremendous concern about the inappropriately high status and influence accorded to people like chief scientific advisors and their staffs within government departments. And word for word, you could take that over for senior statisticians. One might think of resurrecting an old Treasury idea, which was when departments were putting forward their bids for funding for policy developments. There was, for a while, a Treasury requirement that they documented and put on the web the sources of all the evidence that they were using to do that. That idea then faded away. So how about an early approach from the RSS to the new Statistics Board, which will be looking to make a fresh start, will be looking for an agenda, to put high on the agenda an audit of the use of statistical advisors and the use and non-use of statistical evidence that's been provided across all government departments in recent years, and the relationship between those senior advisors and the press office, and in many cases the totally inappropriate ranking of relationship at the moment where those advisors are subservient to the press office in terms of who they can talk to and how they can talk to them. Time I stopped. A lot of positive things have happened over the last 10 years, much of it due to the efforts of lots of those present in this room and their colleagues. And I wouldn't be so despondent that Campbell et al. Is not yet at the state of Cochrane. Don't forget that we had 50 years plus of a lot of input into medical statistics that preceded that, and there's no comparable body of stuff and commitment in the general social sciences. So these things take time. But just to have some form of words to end on, both in terms of education, communication, and the removal of spin, there is still much to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. I should do two things, I suppose. I should give a slight response from my perspective, and then move into thanking you. So I mean, in a sense, it's almost improper to make an immediate response, because I think what you've raised is some very deep issues that really need some quite careful thought as to the best way to carry them on. What I am clear about is that the society must have a role in picking up the sorts of challenges that you've thrown out. But the way that role runs out, I think, does need some careful thought. And I think if I take the difference between trying to influence journalists and the BBC through to trying to promote better experimentation and evidence base in terms of social research and development and policy, therefore, and then the sort of thing that you've just been talking about in terms of the crime statistics, the picture is really quite different in each of those. We've tried little bits in the last. I hope I'm not demeaning what we have tried to do, but we have tried educating journalists. We have tried educating judges and people in the criminal justice system, for example, in terms of the way that statistics is used. Now, we probably haven't done anywhere near enough of that, but we need to do a lot more, I think, as a society. Sheila and I, in the wings of this conference, have been talking about the role of experimentation in social policy and how can we, the society, try to promote that much more strongly than we have been doing. And I think I draw a lesson from what you've said, because we could do that as a society. I'd much sooner try and build a broader consensus across the social sciences to work with the society to prepare and mount a campaign to try and achieve that. These campaigns are not short. I mean, in modern history, we advocated legislation for statistics in 1982 or something like that.
1990?
Okay, but I was talking about modern history. Okay, but even when the framework for statistics was created in 2000, and I know what happened, and the government didn't want legislation, so they kicked it into the long grass. I mean, it's taken now another 7 years. So these are not short campaigns. The other lesson I think we need to reflect on is, and Richard Aldrich's left, so I can say this, is that your report has provoked a response. The Commission has produced a whole series of very excellent reports as a sort of an outsider, if you like, which have not actually provoked a positive response from within government. And the difference, I think, between the two is that the Home Office, through Charles Clarke, had ownership of the creation of the process, and therefore ownership of responding and reacting to the recommendations that came. So the issue for us, I think, is to think through whether we act as an external provocateur to say this is what you should do, or whether sometimes we try to actually act to promote ownership within a particular department or particular area to create some process which we can then contribute to, which may actually, in the longer term, have a bigger impact. So I think we need to reflect on all of these issues. And that's my just off-the-cuff response to Adrian's really, really excellent paper and excellent discussion. I hope I haven't done you much less than proper justice. It's very difficult to give an immediate response in that way. But I do believe the society has to take on Adrian's agenda. And it won't be a 6-month take on or even a 6-year take on, actually. It's longer than that. I think I'd like to call this session... sorry, you might want to respond to that. You want to go? Okay, fine. Adrian has to get a train, that's why I apologise. Okay. I'm going to...
Sorry.
Okay. Be in touch with you. So I responded because Adrian said to me when we started, you ought to respond to what I'm going to say to. So I was a suddenly designated discussant. Brings us to the end of the conference. I've got a couple of things to say, not very much at all, and we wind up. The first thing is a silly bit of housekeeping, and that is that if you haven't returned your keys, you have to do that, so don't forget that. The second thing, I think, is that we promised whatever it was, a nano iPod or something to people. So we have a set of cards or something, and I am going to draw one of these. Do you trust me as a statistician to draw a card from here? As for the recipient of this, I'll give them a good stir around, and I'm going to take... Probably this is selection bias. The largest card is likely to get the prize. But the person... What is it? Oh, that's lucky. I thought we were giving it to a member of the staff at the office. On the back of the card is the name of the person who's going to receive... What is it again? A nano iPod? iPod Nano. Oh, okay, fine. I always get confused with some of these names where you're not quite sure what is the family name and which is the given name. Anyway, the recipient, but it's not here, but we will no doubt be in contact with you, is Kate Payton, is it P-A-T-O-N?
Yes, yeah. She won the prize.
Now there's an artfully significance, isn't there, or Frank Duckworth in RSS News. Anyway, it was in front of. I mean, you can't get a more cynical and questioning audience than this one, and you saw it was absolutely right. I didn't have many cards up my sleeves when I put my hand in the bag. Okay. Thank you all for coming. We need to move on. I speak for myself. I've had a really interesting conference. I've listened to some really, really good presentations. And the standard of presentations, the accessibility of what's being said, I thought I understood quite a lot of it, which is really, really terrific. So thank you all for that. I thanked everybody last night. I won't do so again, but there was one group that I didn't thank last night. I didn't thank the speakers. I think they've done a terrific job all the way through the conference, both in terms of preparing and willing to present, but also in the manner in which they presented, as I've just said. And I didn't thank all of you that have contributed to discussion in the various rooms and so forth, and in the corridors and around. So thank all of you for making this, I think, an extremely successful conference.